In 1943, confused families in Richland and Hanford were given just weeks to leave their homes and evacuate to the nearby Yakima Valley. What they didn't know was that their home would eventually become the most contaminated nuclear site in the country.
Constructed during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project, Hanford fueled the first nuclear weapons and ushered in a scientific revolution whose consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. But what began as a wartime necessity soon provoked a widespread public reaction as environmental contamination, worker exposure, and indigenous displacement came to light. Hanford represents a revolutionary expansion of state power and scientific authority that transformed warfare, provoking sustained public reaction to environmental and human harm, which ultimately enabled sweeping legal, environmental, and historical reforms. Its legacy endures in how the Hanford nuclear site and subsequent reactions influenced U.S. nuclear warfare policy, informed environmental regulations, and triggered reflection on government accountability. By the late 1930s, global political, scientific, and military structures were undergoing profound upheaval. Fascism was on the rise in Europe, the global economy remained fragile following the Great Depression, and international tensions escalated as Adolf Hitler's regime aggressively expanded across the continent. The invasion of Poland in 1939 triggered World War II, drawing nations into a conflict that would redefine the balance of power. Simultaneously, a revolution on the scientific front was unfolding in laboratories across Europe and the United States. Advances in theoretical physics, most notably Albert Einstein's theory of relativity and discoveries by scientists such as Niels Bohr and Enrico Fermi, had begun to unlock the immense energy stored within the atom. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working alongside physicist Lisa Meitner, discovered nuclear fission. This breakthrough revealed the possibility of an energy release far greater than any conventional weapon could achieve. As Nazi Germany advanced across Europe, many Jewish and anti-fascist scientists fled persecution, carrying their knowledge to Allied nations. These scientists, acutely aware of Hitler's ambitions, feared that the Nazi regime might harness nuclear technology first. Their concern culminated in 1939 when Albert Einstein and physicist Leo Szilard warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that the atomic weapons were not only possible, but imminent. Roosevelt's response was swift. The U.S. government launched an unprecedented secret scientific enterprise, the Manhattan Project. Under the leadership of General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project mobilized more than 130,000 people across multiple sites nationwide, including Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and eventually Hanford, Washington State. The aim was, simply put, strategic survival. The federal government selected a remote region in southeastern Washington along the Columbia River for the crucial task of producing plutonium, an element that would yield unprecedented amounts of explosive power for the bomb's core. The area's isolation, access to water, and proximity to hydroelectric power made it ideal for nuclear production. Entire communities, including indigenous peoples and farming families, were forcibly removed with minimal explanation or compensation. The land was seized under wartime authority, and construction began immediately. To the government, secrecy was paramount. The project was framed as a necessary sacrifice for survival, with national security used as a justification for the extraordinary measures taken, which included the relocation of communities, land seizures, and construction of entire towns under the claim of classified authority. Scientists worked under extreme pressure, racing against time with limited knowledge of radiation's long-term effects. Workers were told only that they were contributing to the war effort, leaving few with the full understanding of the nature of their work.
At Hanford's height, more than 50,000 workers were employed at the nuclear site, many of whom had no idea what they were building. Housed in hastily constructed government towns like Richland and Hanford, the reactors these workers operated produced plutonium that would eventually fuel the bomb dropped on Nagasaki in August 1945. To scientists and military officials, Hanford represented the pinnacle of modern engineering, as human ingenuity triumphed over natural limits to usher in the first nuclear bombs. The atomic age had arrived. Despite the victory on the scientific front, environmental consequences posed prominent, enduring challenges for the community. The reactors at Hanford released radioactive waste into the air, soil, and water under the assumption that dilution and distance would mitigate harm. From 1944 through the early Cold War years, Hanford conducted routine, quote, green runs, deliberately releasing radioactive iodine into the atmosphere to test monitoring equipment. Importantly, they did so without ever informing the public, particularly downwind communities in eastern Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Many residents consumed contaminated milk, water, and produce, particularly children, whose developing thyroid glands were especially vulnerable. Hanford workers, too, faced exposure risks in the absence of comprehensive safety protocols, which only encouraged laborers to handle radioactive materials without adequate protection. The culture of secrecy prevented them from asking questions, and whistleblowers faced professional retaliation. Decades later, former employees like Seth Ellingsworth confessed that, quote, there were a few months where I thought I was dying. There were a few months where I welcomed it. Indigenous communities experienced compounded harm. Russell Jim, a member of the Yakama Nation, described Hanford as their wintering ground.
The Hanford area was our wintering ground, the Palm Springs of the area.
For them, Hanford was not merely an industrial site, but a, quote, wound in the heart of our homeland.
And so the effects of on the land has been horrendous, but to what extent we do not know. We would like to have answers.
Yet eventually, by the 1960s and 1970s, as environmental consciousness grew nationwide, the silence surrounding Hanford began to fracture. Journalists, scientists, and local activists demanded transparency. The broader context of post-war distrust, a culture built through the public's experiences following Vietnam, Watergate, and civil rights struggles, fueled skepticism towards government authority. Former workers, downwinders, and those involved in the cleanup effort testified before Congress, making statements such as, quote, I was floored, surprised, and angry. I would want to be made aware of the exposure and get checked out. I think that's reasonable, end quote. These voices actively challenged the legitimacy of a system that held privileged secrecy over safety. Their collective activism, which consisted of filing lawsuits, demanding federal hearings, and pressing for compensation, loudly demanded public indictment. By the late 20th century, the consequences of Hanford's production mission could no longer remain hidden. Beneath the desert plateau sat 56 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste stored in 177 underground tanks, many of which was built in the 1940s with limited life expectancy. Some had leaked, allowing contaminants such as cesium-137 and technetium-99 to migrate towards the Columbia River. What had once symbolized engineering triumph now became the most contaminated nuclear site in the United States, saturated with the horrific residues of the Cold War. On May 15, 1989, after years of public pressure and environmental litigation, the U.S. Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Washington State Department of Ecology signed the Hanford Federal Facility Agreement and Consent Order, commonly known as the Tri-Party Agreement. Grounded in the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980 and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, the agreement legally bound the federal government to a structured cleanup schedule. Cleanup efforts have since involved thousands of scientists and engineers, the construction of vitrification facilities to immobilize waste, and groundwater treatment systems to contain radioactive plumes. Though costly and technically complex, the effort represents institutional reform, an acknowledgement that national security does not absolve the state of long-term environmental responsibility.
Reform also took the form of historical preservation. In 2008, the B reactor and other portions of the site were designated as part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. For downwinders, workers, and indigenous communities, the preservation of Hanford institutionalized memory and validated decades of activism, ensuring that the legacy of displacement and exposure accompanied the narratives of scientific innovation. This nuclear site thus stands as a powerful illustration of how scientific revolution prompted public reaction and ultimately compelled legal, environmental, and historical reform, embedding accountability into the legacy of the atomic age.